Can you conceive of a more pleasurable experience in Paris in a cloudy morning than opening my YouTube channel and wading through your comments? I cannot. So sometimes I come across topic suggestions which are thought-provoking and interesting. Today we're going to discuss siblings. How likely are siblings to develop narcissistic personality disorder? How probable it is that your siblings are narcissists? And is there anything in the order of birth or the treatment by parental treatment, or is there anything that determines whether specific siblings might become narcissists while others do not? My name is Samvaknin. I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited. So let's start with a fact. Only a tiny minority of people develop narcissistic personality disorder. According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 1.7% of the general population. This is not an underestimate. Narcissists are not underdiagnosed. Actually, overt narcissists are overdiagnosed. But this is a topic for another video. You can search the channel if you want the data. So a tiny percentage become narcissists. And yet, in the very same family, exposed to the very same parenting style, preferences, abuse, trauma, adverse childhood experiences, very same household, only one child becomes a narcissist, while the other 5 siblings or 2 siblings or 1 sibling don't. This is true even with twins. There are twin studies. This is a strong indication that pathological narcissism is an interaction between the environment and a predisposition, a genetic hereditary predisposition. We do not have rigorous, convincing, sufficient evidence to say this with any certainty. Yet it stands to reason. It's very likely. Now we know that there are 2 developmental paths leading to pathological narcissism. And one of them is when the child is idolized, pedestalized, overprotected, instrumentalized, parentified. When the child can do no wrong, is isolated from reality and from peers. This kind of child is likely to become an overt narcissist if the genetic propensity is there, if the genetic template is there. We think. There's no proof of this, but it stands to reason. The other developmental path is when the child is neglected, abandoned, shamed, humiliated, or classically abused, physical abuse, verbal abuse. In this case, there's a likelihood of development of covert narcissism rather than overt narcissism. So these are 2 developmental paths. Both of them lead to Rome, the Rome of narcissism. Similarly, favoritism, when certain children are treated much better than their siblings, or some brothers and sisters are mistreated while others are not. The classic emergent roles of scapegoat and golden child and so on and so forth. In this case, again, there's a likelihood of narcissism, but you should never ever listen to self-styled so-called experts online, because they would tell you that narcissism is the outcome of having been treated as a golden child, whereas the scapegoat never develops narcissism. Scapegoat becomes the victim. That's complete nonsense. Both the scapegoat and the golden child are likely to develop narcissism, albeit of different kinds. The scapegoat is likely to develop a passive-aggressive, resentful type of narcissism known as fragile or shy or vulnerable narcissism, whereas the golden child is far more likely to develop overt narcissism, mistakenly called grandiose narcissism. So both types might react with narcissism to the preferential treatment, the favoritism of the parents. towards one of the children. I've dealt with all this in other videos, and you go to the description, there's a link to one of them. It's called Child and Scapegoat, Black Sheep, Narcissist Parents Projective Splitting. I recommend that you watch it. This is not the topic of today's video. Today's video has been triggered by two comments. The first one, I quote, "Innate temperament regarding siblings' outcomes for personality disorders. Can you tell us about it?" Yes, I can. The second question, besides narcissistic parents who view their child's autonomy and growth as a threat to their ego, might narcissistic siblings also feel threatened? And the answer is yes, of course. The same dynamic that plays out with parental figures, plays out with siblings, plays out with peers. Peers are very influential, especially during early adolescence and late childhood. Plays out with role models, such as teachers, and so on. It's exactly the same dynamic. But I will expand on it a bit later. And finally, the last question was, does being a girl and the youngest child have an impact? Well, the answer to this is being a girl does not have an impact. Although the expression of narcissism, pathological narcissism, in women is culturally and societally determined. So whereas men would tend to become more antisocial, overt narcissists, mistakenly called grandiose narcissists, because all narcissists are grandiose, even covert narcissists are grandiose, women would tend to become covert. They would tend to become fragile or vulnerable narcissists, and women would tend to incorporate borderline elements, including, for example, a much higher level of emotion dysregulation. These are not psychological, these are not etiological or psychological or psychodynamic factors. These are social, the outcomes of social pressures, social mores and expectations, cultural dynamics and scripts. So the narcissism of the woman is determined from the outside, whereas the narcissism of the men is determined mostly from the inside. And this is the answer to the question of, does being a girl have any impact on developing narcissism? Does being the youngest child have any impact? Well, I'm going to deal with this in this video. So let's plunge and delve right in, and we start with an article, a very old, well, relatively old article, 1996, written by Sobelman and Eyring. And the article is titled Narcissism and Birth Order. It was published in Psychological Reports. Now, you go to the description, there's a literature section with all these articles. So what did this article teach us? I'm quoting from the abstract. The purpose of this investigation, say the authors, was to clarify the relationship between birth order position and the development of narcissism, while refining research and theory. The relationship between birth order status and narcissism was examined with a sample of 79 undergraduate students, 55 women and 24 men. These subjects were placed in one of the four following birth order categories: firstborn, secondborn, lastborn, and only children. These categories were chosen given their significance in Adlerian theory. Each subject completed a narcissistic personality inventory and a demographic inventory. Now, just to alert you to the fact that the NPI, Narcissistic Personality Inventory, measures the trait of narcissism, not pathological narcissism, and not narcissistic, and cannot be used to diagnose narcissistic personality disorder. Okay. Based on psychodynamic theory, say the authors, it was hypothesized that firstborn children were expected to score highest. But statistical significance was not found for an association between narcissism and birth order. Now, this was in 1996, and we need to go a bit back in time to find additional work. Curtis and Cowell, 1993, published an article, Relation of Birth Order and Scores on Measures of Pathological Narcissism. It was published in Psychological Reports. Again, I'll read to you from the abstract. To study the relationship between birth order and pathological narcissism, It was predicted that firstborn and only children would score significantly higher on standardized measures of pathological narcissism. Two such measures, the Millen Clinical Multi-Axial Inventory and the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, were administered to 50 randomly selected subjects from a metropolitan mental health and family treatment agency. Subjects were asked to indicate their ordinal birth positions, in other words, firstborn, middleborn, lastborn, or only child. And then they were administered with both these instruments. They were tested using both these instruments. Analysis supported the initial prediction by indicating that firstborn and only children had higher mean scores on the measures of pathological narcissism. It might be advisable for clinicians to identify patients' ordinal positions. Are they firstborn? Are they only children? While appraising relevant diagnostic criteria and eventual treatment planning. So here we are, two studies, 3 years apart, substantially in disagreement. One study says, yes, the birth order is highly relevant. If you're firstborn and if you're only child, you're more likely to become a narcissist. And the other study says no such thing. There's no influence, there's no connection or correlation between birth order or being an only child and the evolution or the dynamic of pathological narcissism in any single individual. We need, therefore, to continue to peruse the literature, and let's move forward in time to 2024. Hopefully, we have learned something in the intervening years. So here's a study on conscientiousness, narcissism, and self-esteem among firstborn and lastborn siblings. It was written by Anoushka, Malik. It was published in the International Journal of Interdisciplinary Approaches in Psychology in 2024, as I said. The abstract says, often in our society we come across statements like, firstborns are more responsible, or middleborns are often the ignored children. Such statements usually pique the interest of individuals and are also the propagator of misinformation. While there might be slight differences in the bringing up of children, its impact on the personality of these individuals is not major. To further investigate this, there was a sample, about 60 people, 80 to 25 years old. 30 of them were firstborn, 30 were lastborn. The purpose, says the author, was to study conscientiousness, narcissism, and self-esteem among firstborn and lastborn children. Standardized scales were used to measure these stated variables. The results found a significant positive correlation between conscientiousness and self-esteem, and a significant positive correlation between narcissism and self-esteem. However, not statistically significant differences were observed in self-esteem, conscientiousness, and narcissism among firstborn or lastborn siblings. There was no difference between firstborns and lastborns. Due to the firstborn siblings usually taking up the role of substitute parents for the later born, it is often believed that the siblings, according to their placement in the family, possess different personality traits. However, evidence from the present study as well as past studies suggests that birth order does not have a lasting impact on broad personality traits outside of the intellectual domain, and any variations may have to do with the genetics rather than familial positioning of individuals. So this is the latest in the field. We now tend to believe that the order of birth has very little impact on whether an individual develops pathological narcissism or not. This is definitely true, for example, in twin studies where the order of birth is irrelevant. So if you're firstborn or if you're lastborn, it seems you have an equal chance to develop pathological narcissism, to become a narcissist, to be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, which is another strong indication that narcissistic personality disorder may be hereditary. There may be a genetic template or predisposition or proclivity to develop pathological narcissism on condition that the individual is exposed to an environment which is abusive or traumatizing, or both, exposed to adversity in some way. Okay, Daphne, Beck, Ohem, Schmackel, and others in 2019 have published the article "The End of a Stereotype. Only children are not more narcissistic than people with siblings." Allow me to repeat. Only children are not more narcissistic than people with siblings. This particular article was published in Social, Psychological, and Personality Science, and here is what the abstract has to say. The current research dealt with the stereotype that only children are more narcissistic than people with siblings. We first investigated, say the authors, the prevalence of this stereotype. In an online study, quite a big one, 600 people, people rated a typical only child and a typical person with siblings on narcissistic admiration and narcissistic rivalry, the two subdimensions of the narcissistic admiration and rivalry questionnaire. People ascribed both higher admiration and higher rivalry to the only child. So this is the stereotype. This is what you hear from self-styled experts online. The authors proceed to say, we then tested the accuracy of this stereotype by analyzing data from a large and representative panel study, 1,800 people plus. The scores of only children on the two narcissism dimensions did not exceed the scores of people with siblings, and this result held when major, potentially confounding covariates were controlled for. Taken together, the results indicate that the stereotype that only children are narcissistic may be prevalent, but is not accurate. So, another article published in 2020 was authored by Foster, Raley, Isen, and others. It was titled "Further Evidence That Only Children Are Not More Narcissistic Than Individuals with Siblings." It was published in Personality and Individual Differences, volume 161. So here is what these authors had to say in support of the previous study that I've cited. They say, are only children more narcissistic than individuals with siblings? Prior research on the topic has produced conflicting and/or inconclusive results. Daphne et al. In 2019 published a recent and widely reported empirical test of this hypothesis and concluded that only children are not more narcissistic than non-only children with siblings. One of their acknowledged limitations was that their study was limited to the German population. They called for additional tests in other countries. In this paper, say the authors, we report results from a high-powered test of this hypothesis using multiple measures of narcissism, 2 full-scale and 10 facet level measures, and a large sample, 9,000 people. That's a seriously big study. Although I must say that all 9,000 people were American college students, and whether American college students represent humanity is a very serious debate. Anyhow, despite this study possessing extraordinary statistical power, we likewise failed to observe any notable differences in narcissism between only children and non-only children, children with siblings. Follow-up equivalence and Bayesian testing suggested generally strong to very strong support for the null hypothesis that only children and non-only children are equivalent in terms of narcissism. It seems that the mainstream consensus today is that whether you've had siblings or whether you're an only child, your chances to develop pathological narcissism hinge on something that has nothing to do with how many siblings you have and what is your birth order, whether you're firstborn or not. And that something could only be genetics. Because had it been 100% the environment, then we all know that firstborns are treated differently to other siblings. That also has been substantiated and established in multiple studies. And these different treatments should, in theory, have produced pathological narcissism more frequently, but it doesn't. It doesn't. So it seems that there is a powerful genetic determinant here. Ferenc, Lang, Kosho, and others wrote an article titled Sibling Relationship Quality and Parental Rearing Style Influence the Development of Dark Triad Traits. It was published in Current Psychology. May I remind you that dark triad personalities are not narcissists, and they are not psychopaths. Dark triad personality is a personality which comprises subclinical narcissism, narcissism that cannot be diagnosed, subclinical psychopathy, psychopathic traits and behaviors that do not amount to an antisocial personality disorder, and Machiavellianism. So dark triad personality and dark tetrad personality are not personality disorders and are not the same, are not tantamount to narcissistic or antisocial or psychopathic personality disorder. Still, dark triad personalities are reminiscent vaguely of narcissism and psychopathy because they incorporate the subclinical variants. So they are useful proxies. And here is what the article has to say. Currently, our understanding of environmental factors that influence the development of dark personality traits is limited. Therefore, we conducted 3 studies using online questionnaires, each examining a different aspect of the relation between dark personality traits and family environment. I forgot to mention that this is a recent study, 2023. In the first study, 1,100 adults filled out questionnaires regarding their childhood relationship with siblings and their own dark triad traits. We found, say the authors, that the amount of conflicts with siblings during adolescence correlated positively with Machiavellianism and psychopathy, subclinical psychopathy. The feeling of closeness towards the siblings showed negative correlation with Machiavellianism. In other words, if your childhood with siblings has been a high conflict childhood, you constantly had fights with your siblings, you were competing for your parents' attention and affection and love with your siblings, and so on and so forth. Your siblings were perceived, in the best cases, rivals, and in the worst cases, adversaries or enemies. You were more likely to develop Machiavellianism, which is a tendency to manipulate people, manipulativeness, and you are also more likely to develop subclinical psychopathy. If the relationship with your siblings has been wonderful and great and supportive, and so on and so forth, you were not more likely to develop either of these. Parental partiality, favoritism, towards the other sibling was positively correlated with narcissism. In a study, there were 110 adolescents. These adolescents reported their perceptions of the rearing style of their parents, in addition to their sibling relationships and dark triad traits. Perceived parental emotional warmth was negatively associated, whereas both rejection by the parents and overprotection were positively correlated with psychopathy. So here we are not talking about golden child and scapegoat. We are talking about parents who are warm and loving and caring and compassionate and containing and supportive, and parents who are neglectful and abandoning and absent and called what Andre Green calls the dead mother, And so this difference is meaningful later in life. Actually, the parents who are rejecting and the parents who are overprotective both tend to produce more psychopathy in the child. Parental warmth was positively, while rejection was negatively associated with narcissism. So, ironically, if the parents are warm and loving and caring and compassionate and so on and so forth, the child is slightly more likely to develop narcissism than if the parents are rejecting. In other words, what emerges from this study, and we should take it with a grain of salt, and there's a lot more to. We need to repeat this study, and we need to do many other studies, and We need to differentiate between various dimensions of narcissism and psychopathy. But generally speaking, what this study seems to indicate is that rejection, abandonment, neglect enhance or increase the risk of psychopathy in the child. Whereas warmth and loving the child and caring for the child and so on, somewhat mysteriously and ironically, tend to increase narcissism, perhaps because the child feels special, cosseted, and perhaps the study didn't make a sufficient distinction between warm, loving, compassionate parents and spoiling, pampering, pedestalizing, idolizing parents, which is a world apart. These are not the same kind of parenting style. Anyhow, Machiavellianism, continue the authors, was positively associated with the amount of conflicts with siblings, but negatively associated with closeness to siblings. In a third study, 110 adults reported their levels of the vulnerable dark triad that included measures of primary and secondary psychopathy, subclinical psychopathy, maladaptive covert narcissism, subclinical, and borderline personality organization, Kernberg's construct. Results indicated that sibling relation quality had a significant effect on primary psychopathy and borderline traits. Parental rejection and overprotection correlated with borderline traits and vulnerable narcissism. The results of these studies shed some light on how environmental impulses, particularly the quality of relationships between family members, affect the development of personality. This is a pretty interesting study because it demonstrates that there are several developmental trajectories, not only one, and that the interactions between siblings and parenting and parents are very important, and that variations in parenting styles can lead either to narcissism or to psychopathy, and relationships with siblings mostly determine the Machiavellian thing, Machiavellianism thing, the Mach level. It seems that certain types of parenting yield overt narcissism, may yield overt narcissism. Certain types of parenting are conducive to covert narcissism, but in the second case of covert narcissism, sibling involvement is also relevant, and sibling involvement seems to be most relevant in the formation of psychopathy and Machiavellianism.